U.S. grid administrators warn there's an elevated risk of widespread power outages across the nation this summer. The IRS has issued guidelines on what constitutes domestic content or American made when it comes to solar products for tax incentives that have recently been passed. And new solar and wind installations over the last 3 years have exceeded government projections by about 50%. I'm Jay Warmke with Blue Rock Station, and this is the news from the solar industry for the week of May 22nd. Now, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, which is an administrative agency that oversees aspects of the grid, announced recently this week that there is what they anticipate is an elevated risk of widespread power outages due to extreme weather events over the summer. Now, a lot of this comes from global climate change, as well as the fact that quite a number of fossil fuel power plants have been shut down over recent years that have traditionally serviced the grid. Now, advocates for fossil fuels have stepped in and said this is an example of why the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy is a bad idea. Now, NERC came back and said, no, we're not trying to signal that this transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy should be paused, slowed down in any way. They're really just saying that because of these combination of events, we need to be careful during this transition, and it should be managed carefully. Now, the parts of the country that are going to be affected most are going to be the western United States, Texas, and the Carolinas. The IRS has issued guidelines on what constitutes domestic content when it comes to the 10% additional tax credit that's part of the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed last year. Now, the Inflation Reduction Act reestablished a 30% tax credit for the installation of solar on homes, businesses, as well as industry. For commercial applications, there is an additional 10% domestic content. So if it is American made, then you can deduct an additional 10%. This is an attempt to bring a lot of the manufacturing of solar products back to the United States. So what constitutes this? Well, the IRS said it's basically a two-tier process. If steel and iron, it must be 100% American made. And that really means that the metals must be melted and poured here in the United States. They did say that metal fabricators are used to these kind of guidelines and that should not be a problem. The manufactured products, however, are going to be a little bit more complicated. These would be, for example, solar panels, inverters, disconnect switches, things of that nature. And what they're saying is that 40% of the content must be American made. Now, there was confusion around what constitutes, for example, a solar panel, how you would judge whether it's American made. There's silicon, there's raw silicon that must go into the solar cells. Must that be mined in America, for example? The solar cells themselves, do they have to be manufactured in America? Or can they simply be brought in and the panel unit be assembled here in the United States? Well, the initial IRS guidelines is basically that the final product must be assembled in the United States to constitute that it is in fact American made. Now that's significant for solar because currently about 95% of all of the solar cells that are distributed across the world are made in China, and about 80% of the panels themselves are made in China. So, of course, trying to bring panel production to the U.S. is an issue, but at least in the near term, the solar cell is okay to import. President Biden has vetoed a bill that came from the House and the Senate that would overturn the pause on tariffs associated with 4 Southeast Asian nations. A little bit of background on this is essentially there was a tariff imposed on Chinese manufactured solar panels, and then much of the production shifted to 4 Southeastern Asian nations, Cambodia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand. Now, people against this said this was simply Chinese panels shifting to a different location. A lawsuit was brought. There was an investigation. And while this was going on, there was the possibility that these tariffs and penalties could be retroactively imposed on all of these panels coming into the U.S. Well, those panels from those 4 nations constitute about 80% of all of the panels used in the country. So it severely disrupted the industry. So last year, the Biden administration said, let's put a 2-year pause on these tariffs, retroactive tariffs that could be put in place. Let's investigate this. The IRA was passed to try and encourage domestic production. Well, Congress just recently voted to overturn that tariff pause. Well, Biden's veto means that it would have to go back to Congress, receive 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate, which seems very unlikely. The Commerce Department is set to rule on the initial lawsuit regarding these tariffs on August 18th. New solar and wind installations over the last 3 years in the U.S. have exceeded government projections by about 50%. Currently, about 27.67% of all of the generating capacity on the U.S. grid comes from renewables. This is up about 5% from 3 years ago when it was just over 22%. So far this year, about 2/3 of all the new generating capacity installed on the grid is renewable. And projections by the government agencies that missed the last projections say that by 2026, we should be seeing a little over 1/3 of all of the generating capacity on the grid coming from renewable energy. Now, this will mean that natural gas generating capacity will go from 44% currently to about 42%. Coal, production from coal will drop from about 17% to around 14%. And production from nuclear energy will decline from about 8% to about 7.5%. We Recycle Solar has announced that they've expanded their facility in Yuma, Arizona, that processes and recycles old solar panels. This makes it the largest facility of this type in the nation. This company was established in 2019, and since that time has recycled and repurposed about 500,000 solar panels. The expansion of this facility to 75,000 square feet means that they can process about 7,500 solar panels each day, which they claim is about 25% of the current domestic need for reprocessing of solar panels. Now, it's expected that this will go up dramatically over the coming years as solar panels that have been installed over recent decades come to the end of their life or are damaged in weather or other events. Now, We Recycle Solar has said that they intend to quadruple their facility over the next 5 years or so. And that's the news from the solar industry for this week. We'll see you next week.